Okay, I think we're just about ready to begin here in just a moment. Sorry, Gregory. Okay, so we're going to begin here. So hello, everyone, and welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for Digital Innovation, Transformation, and Entrepreneurship in an Age of Generativity. Today, we will hear from Associate Professor of Information Technology at HEC Montreal, Gregory Vial. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube Live from Fourth Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. At Fourth Space, we work with our university community to mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities to examine research questions and projects in development here at the university. We are running this event as a live stream meeting, so we welcome your comments and questions with a raised hand or via the chat if you're joining by Zoom. For those of you in the space, if you'd like to participate, just let us know by raising a hand and we'll be sure to get a microphone to you. It is now my pleasure to hand it over to Director of the MSc Program in Business Analytics at the John Molson School of Business, Suchit Ahuja.
Thank you. Welcome, a warm welcome to everybody in person as well as online. So today we are here with Gregory Vial from HEC Montreal because he's here for a keynote speech for our event today, which was the DITE Symposium, which is the Digital Innovation, Transformation and Entrepreneurship Research Symposium, where our MSc and Ph.D. students presented their research and will get feedback from the community. It's also a celebration of all of the research that they've done so far, and it's a good opportunity for us to get together. So with that, I'll officially welcome Gregory. We are looking forward to your talk, which is highly relevant topic, highly informational for all of us. Gregory is an associate professor of information technology at HEC. His research focuses on digital transformation, software development, and data. He's very accomplished. His work has been published in top-tier research journals within MIS, such as Information Systems Research, MIT Sloan Management Review, Journal of Strategic Information Systems, and the European Journal of Information Systems. So with that, Gregory, welcome. We look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll just start sharing the presentation. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And when I was first invited to come give this keynote, I had to come up with a topic. And I was working on questions related to generativity, which is a popular topic that's starting to gain a lot of traction outside of information systems as well. And there's a lot of ideas that I want to talk about today that relate to how we can approach generativity to stimulate research on digital innovation, transformation, and entrepreneurship. And some of those things that I'm going to present today are related to how we can think about these elements of DITE research through the lens of generativity. It's one of the many ways we can do so, but I think it's an interesting opportunity to see things from a different perspective than from what we see usually. And it's also a way to question some of the things that we've been doing in recent years. And I was listening earlier during the panel that you had in the other building. And some of the things I'm going to mention today actually resonate with a lot of the things I've heard today. So I was happy to see that there's a connection here between some ideas we can have in research and some of the things that we can think about when we're talking about more bridging the gap with practitioners, for example. So the question I asked myself is, are we there yet? When I was preparing for this, and are we there yet really is this question of when are we done? When are we finished? When have we explored everything that's in the topic? And if you're working in this area, you know that we'll probably never be done, which is a good thing for us as academics. But there's a lot of questions that turn up every time we lift a stone and we think we're done with one aspect of the phenomenon. Something else comes up, and it's like, oh, we could do this, we could do that. And I want to bring a reflection on how I think about these things, but not necessarily just as someone who studies these topics. really, the question here for me is not just as an author, but it's also as someone who reviews a lot of the papers that get submitted on the topic in IS journals primarily, of course, but also as someone who teaches on the topic. So at HEC, we have a class on digital transformation. This semester, we introduced a class on artificial intelligence at the master's level. So there's a lot of topics that revolve around these ideas as well. And it's just tackling them from different perspectives. So at any point, if you have questions, comments, disagreements, please, by all means, let me know. I'll be very happy to have the discussion live. Don't save your questions for the end. Don't hesitate. And because these things are what I think currently about these topics, if you ask me the question again in 6 months, probably my opinion will have changed. The best example of that is when I was preparing for the class that I was teaching in the winter on artificial intelligence. I prepped the class back in the summer of 2022. In November 2022, ChatGPT came out, and I basically had to scrap half of what I had done. And then, okay, what are we going to do in the winter now, right? So every week during the winter, we had an episode of 15 minutes at the start of the class of what happened this week with ChatGPT, because there was just so much coming out at such a fast pace that we were just trying to keep up and digest all that information that was coming out. So a lot of the things that we discuss on the topic are transient, and there's an evolution in how we think about the phenomena, which I think is very stimulating, but it's also quite exhausting at the same time, because we feel like it's like a thread that runs and we're never really catching it. So if that's how you feel, I share your sentiment. And of course, your experience may vary. And I'd be very happy to hear different experiences as well, because it's a very broad area of research that has very much a lot of disciplines involved as well. And there's a lot of experiences that can be gained from all these cross-pollination across disciplines. So the first thing I have to do here is a disclaimer that everything has been done by myself and not with ChatGPT, okay? This is a 2023 disclaimer you have to put everywhere, but you'd be hard-pressed to know that I didn't use ChatGPT, right? Just like with our students, when we have suspicions now, the best we can do is have suspicions, because we can't tell whether the content has been generated using a generative technology. And I'll make a link between generativity and generative technology, because I think a lot of the efforts that we're seeing right now are turning towards that direction, because there's just a lot of promises, but also a lot of questions that are being raised by a lot of people. And I also promise that I will not hold you up for an entire hour. So I will invite you to ask me questions. My personal take on research in general is a process that's a mix of intense pleasure and enjoyment and extreme pain and frustration, which I think some of us can relate. It's this idea that we think about a topic, a question, and we're interested in it, and it looks like it's approachable, and we feel like we have a good intuition about it. So we start throwing ourselves into it and pouring our energy, and we're like, okay, it should be okay. There's an interesting idea here. It looks like it's something to do with it. And then there's inevitably this realization that it's infinitely more complicated or more complex than we thought it would be. And this is where we start to have this realization that I'll never be able to do it. And progressively, we become more frustrated with how the topic is being approached by others, by ourselves, and how we can work on it. And there's just this complete mess and this tangle of knots that we're trying to undo. And when we talk about DITE research, because of all the interconnections between innovation, transformation, and entrepreneurship, these tangles are all very apparent, but they also appear as we untangle one knot, we find another knot, right? And eventually, we kind of have a phase of semi-enlightenment where we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and we say, okay, if I can boil down the contribution to something very specific, very narrow, then I can make sense of this, and I can do something. And then that's how we move forward, right? And then the next step is to do it all over again and say, why did I do this? And I shouldn't be doing this. It's not good for my mental health, but the enjoyment we get out of doing the research is just such that we're pushed intrinsically to study these things. And the reason I say this is because one of the key points I'll be bringing towards the end of the presentation relates to how we do research and how the pace at which things are going makes it more and more challenging for us to do the research the way we might be used to doing it or the way we might want to do it. And I'll refer to this towards the end, but it relates to this idea that it takes time and it takes a lot of work to feel comfortable studying something and to be comfortable trying to build something. So the starting point is really the knot and the tangle. And you have all these different strands that represent different areas of research. So for example, in here you could have innovation, transformation, entrepreneurship, and you could be trying to say, okay, what if I try to untangle one and just isolate one from the others and study that one and leave the others on the side for now? Or if you get this knot where you have different colors tangled together and you're trying to separate them to make sense of what it is and how the pattern that you're seeing came to be. And this is where it's complicated, in my opinion, because these are topics that are not natively information systems topics. So for someone like me, who's a purebred IS researcher, if you tell me about innovation and entrepreneurship, it's outside of my comfort zone. Transformation, we have some background on that, but what it means is it's intrinsically multidisciplinary. And that's something that I think explains part of the reason why we see teams of researchers from different disciplines teaming together to tackle these topics, because we each bring part of the equation, but we don't have the whole solution on our own, right? And this is what makes it also quite interesting, is we can learn a lot. And I heard that earlier today, there's a lot we can learn with people who bring in different specialties and different ideas to the table. The first thing that I wanted to do as well was to start with a question. And it's a question more for you than for myself, because I don't have the answer. If everything is digital, and it is in 2023, right? Or most of it is. Why does it still matter to qualify something as digital? How is that different from what we've been doing in the past? Is it actually different? If you read papers, we often still compare the old way technology systems to the new way where everything is digital. But this raises a number of questions, right? First, my perception of what is old technology is not the same one as my students. My students think the website, the Amazon website from 2010 is ancient. I don't really think it's that ancient. I'm from way back then, right? So we don't have the same points of references. So how do we qualify what we mean by digital, really? And that's something that authors are increasingly trying to study as well. Their point being that there's an ontological question here, which is, what is digital something? What is digital X, for example? What is digital transformation, digital entrepreneurship, innovation? What are those specific qualities that force us to name it something else than just innovation, entrepreneurship, and transformation, right? And it's a bit of an open question. There's a few papers that are coming out, papers that are being sent as well to journals right now that seek to make a clear distinction. It appears to be quite complex. It also appears to be a matter of perspective, but this is something that we're starting to see. It's this question of, is it really that different or not? And it's interesting because there are some people who don't really think that it is. And there's people who say, no, it's fundamentally different. We're not equipped. We don't have the right tools to study it the way we used to study these things. And I don't know if there's a solution or really a right answer to this, but what it raises is the idea that depending who you talk to, there is going to be a way to present this idea that's going to be different. So if you do research and you send your papers to certain journals, you have to see how the conversation is being weaved into the different articles, so that you can inscribe yourself within that conversation and pick the journal for you, and also write the paper the way the journal will be receptive to that. And some journals are very strong on certain ideas, others are a lot more open, but there's definitely a conversation and a pattern of differences that's emerging in some outlets. And there's even papers now that question the concept of technology the way we've been thinking about it. So I was reading this paper the other day in Strategic Organization by Samar Faraj and Paul Leonardi, and they're talking about the fact that we're not equipped necessarily, even in terms of vocabulary, to think about technology the way we used to and the way we're able to create things nowadays. So there's a lot of things going on right now in the field, but also outside of information systems. This last paper is in strategic organization. It's not your typical information systems journal that you cite. So scholars from other disciplines are coming into what we would traditionally consider to be our specialty and asking questions that really make us rethink about some of those things we take for granted, which stimulates a lot of conversation. But what it means is the conversation's not just happening at the core of the field, but also at the boundaries with the other fields. And the positioning then is different, right? Because the point of references are not the same. Now, one important aspect as well is how do we study phenomenon? So when we study something related to DITE and any other phenomenon, really, we're going to be using a certain lens, a theoretical lens or a conceptual lens or a specific theory, whatever you want to call it. And really that changes how we look at the world. It informs us on what are we supposed to be looking at, how are we supposed to be looking at it, and what is the outcome we're interested in, right? That influences the perspective we take on the world. And through this, we also have questions that are being raised about the levels of analysis that we're focusing on. And earlier during the panel, this is something that was raised as well. It's, well, are we looking at outcomes for society? Are we looking at outcomes for individuals, for instance? And really, there's no right answer again, but we can take the same thing happening in the world and through different lenses, study different aspects of it with outcomes at different levels. And some of those, I would personally argue, we're well equipped to do. So for instance, at the individual and organizational level, we have the tools, the methods, and the experience to do this. At the society level, I think in information systems, it's a lot harder for us to engage at that level of analysis. The outcomes are much longer time span. They're much broader geographically and socially. So engaging with these kinds of phenomena on that broader scale is quite difficult. And there are disciplines that are specifically studying these things in sociology and others, and those can perhaps bring something to us in terms of, okay, what do we see here that I see this outcome at the individual level, but it has implications through emergence of composition, if you take multi-level theorizing, at the society level. And when does it reach this point that there's an outcome for society, for instance? Because that's some of the arguments is, well, digital transformation can improve society or it has important societal outcomes, whether they're positive or negative as well. But how do we get there? And when can we say there's actually something we can observe for society? So really, there's a way to look at the world, and the advantage of doing that is we focus on specific aspects of a phenomenon. And it clarifies a lot of things for us, right? It gives us ways to approach the world that simplify it and allow us to approach the complexity of the real world, which we would not be able to capture otherwise. There is no theory that allows you to explain everything and that takes care and incorporates every little variable you could have or you could need. The disadvantage, however, is that it focuses on what we think we know about a phenomenon. It doesn't necessarily allow us to capture something that's completely new, because by default, we have these kinds of blinders that can be there and make us think about how the world is without engaging with part of the phenomenon that the blinders don't allow us to see. And the other thing it does is it can oversimplify sometimes. There's not necessarily much we can do about that except acknowledging that one thing we observe at a certain level of analysis should also be thought about at a different level of analysis, for example. And eventually, maybe we can cumulatively build knowledge, but we have to be aware that when we make these choices about focal lenses, theories, and whatnot, we are effectively also restraining part of how we look at the world, which is fine. But it means that the implications also have certain limitations. And the question is, are we well equipped to deal with digital phenomena? Can we build on what we know? Can we use the theories we have? Or do we need entirely new sets of tools, whether it's in terms of methods or conceptual apparatus or whatnot? Can we do what we want to do with what we have, or do we need to invent the tools to help us approach the digital world? It's an ongoing debate. Again, there's researchers who say, you know, there's a lot of good theorizing that's been done in the past. You can't just throw that out and say we need new tools. But there's people who also rightfully question the limitations of those tools we currently have, and the fact that, well, you know, there are certain aspects that we can do with digital technologies that theories from 20 years ago could not even conceive. So it's okay to either try to extend or replace some of those answers with things that are more in tune with with the world now. So essentially what we try to do often is we try to untangle the complexity of the world to separate the strands of different colors, of different flavors. And this is where, when we talk about DITE phenomenon, often what we see is efforts to separate, create separations between innovation, transformation, entrepreneurship. And those allow us to, you know, talk to different aspects of the phenomenon, which is good, because we need to do that. It's too complicated otherwise, it's too messy. And if we treat them as separate streams of knowledge, we're able to make individual contributions more easily in a clearer manner. And when you write scientific work, one of the biggest things you're asked is clarity in how you contribute. You can't just throw the mess out there and let the readers figure it out for you. You really have to piece it out and explain why there's a contribution and how it's being made. But the interesting bits lie at the intersection of these domains, right? If we focus specifically on innovation, transformation, or entrepreneurship, we gain. But often it's if we look at innovation plus transformation, or innovation and entrepreneurship, looking at connections between these subdomains is often where there's a lot of richness that we can extract as well. And the question is, well, how can we engage in that? Because it suddenly becomes a lot more complex. Well, what we see is that studies really show that there are patterns that we observe, but that we also contribute to weave as researchers. When we do research, we're also creating the discourse around the research and engaging in how we think about phenomena. So we're not just observing the world, we're also contributing to shape it in some form or manner. And the challenge is then, if these questions are multidisciplinary, you know, how can we tackle that? Because it's immensely complex. We'll never have the full picture, and all we can do is really build incrementally. There's still tremendous value in separating these different aspects. I'm not saying that we should always consider them together. It allows us to really unpack phenomena much more effectively, especially those that we don't fully understand, and to iteratively refine knowledge. This is how we work. We make a step, we say it's not perfect, we try to correct it, and then we improve it slowly or fast, but we try to address the shortcomings. So for instance, there's papers that are published recently that try to address the shortcomings on research on digital transformation or other topics related to digital technologies to try to bring more clarity. Because if we don't agree on what digital transformation is, then we're all working on different things potentially, right? So that's one of the issues, is to bring clarity and rigor into the process. We can't capture that richness in one paper. That's the reality of it. Is as much as we'd like to, and as much as the initial ideas that motivate us will often make us think that we should bring in all that richness, the reality is that we're not really equipped to do that, and we don't have the real estate in a research paper to do it anyway. So the solution often will be to say, well, you know, maybe what we need to do is look at how we can contribute outside of our core discipline, engage with colleagues in other disciplines, so that the contributions can be scattered across different disciplines rather than being solely focused on one. And we can also look at it as a program rather than a research project, really. That paper is one brick in the wall that we're building that will slowly help us gain more knowledge, knowing full well that will never be done, but at least there's a logic in how we build these bricks together and how we put them together to make a wall, to start a foundation for future knowledge to be built. But it's difficult. It's difficult because we're discovering these things as we're building them, right? So the difficulty is that as we find something, we realize there's something else, and then we realize there's something else. So I think it's important for us to also be forgiving in how we think about these things. We do not anticipate everything, and we cannot anticipate everything, but there's definitely value into thinking about how we take these trends individually, and eventually we form a pattern with them. And we contribute to forming that pattern. And as we do that, it's not just to help us make sense of it, but we're also forming something, you know. Through the research we do on these topics, we're informing practitioners, we can inform policymakers as well, and the research has long-lasting impact on decisions that are made. So based on that, we don't just have the role of an observer, but indirectly or more directly, we can participate into what happens, right? And I think that's one of the opportunities that nowadays we see more perhaps than before, because there's a lot of opportunities or more opportunities now to participate in these other dialogues. Which brings me to the concept of generativity. So generativity is not a new concept, but it's 2006, and the paper from Zittrain is actually in law. It's not in information systems or technology. It's nothing to do with it, but it's this idea that technology can have a capacity to produce unprompted change. And the point is that you can have certain characteristics, the 4 that are listed here, and if technology has those characteristics, there's going to be an opportunity to recombine the technology for another purpose. Not in a directed, controlled way, but more in an organic, really emergent manner in terms of let people figure out what to do with it. And the example that's given by Zittrain in the paper originally is that of the PC. It's this idea that you have this box with components in it that functions as a multi-purpose or really a general purpose machine, and figuring out how people decided to take that and then eventually extend it to build interfaces so that you could connect to the internet and do other things, but you could also play games, you could do a number of other things, but none of that was in the minds of the people who created the PC at first. This comes through emergent innovation from other people who saw the potential in that technology. And generativity has been used quite a bit in information systems research for the past 10 years or so, a lot to theorize on platforms and ecosystems. This idea that we have platforms that are put out there for people to contribute, and we kind of let people decide how they want to use those platforms, contribute to them, and over time, organically, there's an ecosystem that emerges and the platform grows and grows. If you look at platforms like WordPress, for example, with all the plugins that they have, both contributed by open source developers, but also by companies that have made a specialty out of developing these plugins, you look at really something that's grown without any idea a priori that this was going to be the shape it has today. And nobody has any idea of the shape it's going to have in 5 years. But this is this idea that we can have generativity with technology. In recent years, there's people who bring a more nuanced idea, because traditionally we think about generativity as something that's mostly positive. It's great that you can just repurpose it and recombine it in any way. But there are some people who are starting to bring a more nuanced view that there might be limitations to generativity. There might be some undesirable consequences associated with it. And in the past, those haven't really been put forward, but they can be, there can definitely be some issues sometimes. And I'll talk a bit later about the generative AI, but that's, if you think about deepfakes and whatnot, that's, if you look at it this way, that's definitely one potential way that this could be an issue as well. So if we've been studying generativity for the past 10 years or even more, why talk about it? Well, this is where I tie in with generative technologies. And I'll explain later why some generative technologies can have generativity or can exhibit generativity. But conceptually, generative technology is not generativity. Generative technology is a technology that can produce something, whereas generativity is really a property that allows for recombining the technology for other purposes. So there's a difference here, but I'll connect the two very soon. You've all played with or been affected by generative AI, whether it's ChatGPT, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, or other tools that exist nowadays. And it's really shown how far we can go. It's really pushed the envelope. And for me, the main thing that struck me is not so much the technical prowess that's associated with these tools, although it's extremely impressive. It's the speed at which all of that's been coming. And I think nobody really understood how fast these things were going to go, to the point where people had started to say we should slow down. I think, you know, it's one of the first times I remember, at least for all the technology I've heard of, that people start to say, whoa, slow down. You know, it's not something you hear very often when you talk about technology. But generativity as a concept traditionally is interesting for the people who are able to master the technology. Developers who decide to write plugins for WordPress. These are people who have a specialized knowledge that they can use to contribute to something and extend it or recombine it and repurpose it. The example of the PC doesn't necessarily follow that, although 30 years ago, a PC was a very technical thing that not everybody knew how to use. So it still fits with that. One of the interesting things with generative AI and other generative technologies is that the barriers to entry have been lowered considerably. I'm not an AI researcher, and I don't know if any of you are, but we are still able to use ChatGPT and do something with it, right? Why? Because the tool was built to ensure that the barrier for the accessibility of the tool for a random lay person would be extremely low, to the point where the technology behind it is completely obfuscated. You don't get to see or understand how it works. All you get to see is that prompt and the interactions you have with it, right? And what it means is that these generative technologies have really lowered the barrier to entry for people to start using and adopting them. And this is something that, in terms of generativity, we can explain it this way, but what we see is there's a shift in the audience. It's not anymore an audience of people who have specialized skills that they can apply. It's everyone who can start using them, which probably explains part of the success it had. If it had been restricted to select researchers, you know, it probably wouldn't have picked up as much. And in fact, GPT 3.5 had been released a while before ChatGPT, and there was not much noise about it until ChatGPT came out. I don't know if you've seen that picture, you might have. This is now a famous picture that won a digital art contest last year. And there was a bit of an uproar about it because it was generated with generative AI. And people thought, if you have a digital art contest, you're supposed to be using Photoshop and your tablet and doing it manually. But the person who won said, well, you know, I created it with digital technology, so it fits with the idea of digital art. But what it shows for a lot of people, that example, is really how differently we could apply technology. Instead of just automating some repetitive task, which is the typical use case we find, we could ask it to create something or help us create something. And that kind of, this is the click moment for a lot of people where they said, oh, hold on here, you know, this is different. There's something else here. Even though it's based on learning patterns and reproducing them and manipulating them to generate something, the big difference is this is when AI started to enter what we consider to be the sacred area of human knowledge, which is creativity, right? And what followed was people said, well, hold on, if we can do this, then we don't necessarily need to have illustrators to create, you know, these nice graphics for websites or product placements or whatnot. Maybe we don't need content creators for marketing. Maybe we can just have like people who use these tools to generate marketing material in the news as well, to take information and summarize it. All these different use cases where we thought we needed to apply human creativity, suddenly we're being able to use these tools to do it, or part of the work for us. And again, mid-journey stable diffusion had been around for a little bit, but it's really when the moment, this is really the moment where it became extremely popular, because there was a lot of traction in the main media to see the potential for these technologies. But what it raises is this idea that any of us could potentially generate something like that. But I'm really bad at drawing and painting. Like, don't ask me to do that with Photoshop or paintbrushes. I would never be able to. But with a tool like that, I might be able to get something decent, you know. And this is where it's different. I don't need to buy equipment. I don't need to take lessons. It's very easy for me to use it to create something new. Yes?
Thank you so much. So my question is about the creative industry and in fact the role that creativity involves in innovation and entrepreneurship in general. Yes. So regarding the creative industry and the role creativity plays in innovation and entrepreneurship. So are we moving toward a world that human creativity is going to be a premium subscription, or like the machine is completely moving ahead in the sense of creativity? I'm asking this from a perspective of, I mean, in this specific example, or like when you want to come up with an idea for a startup company. So, I mean, is generative AI has that creativity element that, or still the human is going to play a role? So yeah, something.
It's a good question. Right now, there are people who argue that there's going to be so many jobs that are going to be lost. There's a lot of people who also say, hold on, you know, like, first of all, and I'll actually get to that point later, we have to make the decision whether we want that to happen or not. So we have to decide whether we think we don't want people who do these creative things. The other important aspect is that we also, a lot of the use cases consider that we can use AI as a way to accelerate our work, for us to focus on specific aspects where we think human contribution is invaluable. At the end of the day, you can create new content only because you have this history of past content that you've used to train the models, right? So somewhere in there, there's reproduction of patterns that exist, that underlying in the data contained in previous art or in text or whatnot. Whether it's detectable or not is a different question, of course, but without this prior human knowledge, there's no data, and if there's no data, the model doesn't do anything, right? But it's a decision some companies will have to make for certain types of activities or tasks, probably. For example, in January, I was looking in the class with the students. Let's say I start my company and I want to have a logo designed. Well, there's websites now where I say, this is the name of my company, this is what we do, and it generates 25 potential logos for me, and I say, okay, change that color for this and that, and you know, this is something where typically I would have hired someone to help me create a brand image and whatnot. Would I just take the AI generated thing and use it? Maybe, if I have very limited means, for example, and I'm constrained and I want to go fast, maybe. Otherwise, maybe I use that as a startup idea, and then I go see someone and I say, now I want you to infuse very personal touches into that make it different. Because if everyone generates, you know, a logo for their sandwich thing using these tools, those logos are all gonna look like each other. That's one of the issues. It's okay when you look at it, but if you have 25 people doing it and you look at the output, you realize that there are similarities that eventually kind of make it look like it's all more or less variations on the same thing. So I think the human being will stay in the loop, and there's a lot of discussions about that. The question is, when do they intervene and to do what? If you've used ChatGPT, for example, it's very easy to interact with it, but what matters is the prompt that you give. And this is where the human has to understand how to write the right prompt to get the right output, right? And if you do it, you notice at first that it's very easy to get not very good output, but to get good output is sometimes requires more effort than if you had done the work yourself to begin with. So it's like but as you learn to use the tool, then the next time you know how to use it better, and then you know how to get good outputs faster. But that part still requires human thinking so that we use the tool accordingly. So if we tie generative AI to DITE more closely, it allows the emergence of new businesses. That's one thing. We've seen tons of startups that have come up with ChatGPT. But what's interesting is you can do different things, right? You can create your own generative AI, so you innovate by offering a new product. Or what a lot of startups are doing is they're wrapping around the functionality of ChatGPT and OpenAI's APIs, and they're innovating with, right? So it's not just they're creating from scratch, they're just building on top of what's currently offered by OpenAI. We also see a lot of dynamism from open source software communities. OpenAI is supposedly not for profit or was founded as such, but there's a lot of closedness around the work that they do that's being reproached to them right now. And open source communities have been very quick at saying, okay, we're going to create true open systems for generative text system or large language models, for instance. So Hugging Face is a company that's done that. There's other ones as well to try to open really the space so that there's a sharing that's a lot more than if we leave it to one company that takes over that area. But what it does is it has spawned a lot of initiatives, right? And if you look at the space of generative AI, since November, the number of companies that have been started through that is just incredible. What it means for us is that there's a lot of opportunities, right? We can study a lot of these things that are happening. Fundamentally, we have to ask ourselves still, are those new things or is it different variations of what we already know? And I think personally, to me, it depends how you want to frame it. There is a way that you can craft the story around it to show that what we already know can be extended or applied to study it. But you can also look at a different aspect of the phenomenon and then decide that you need to craft something new around it to be able to study it. So going back to this idea that it depends how you want to craft the story and where you're going to send the story that you want to send if you're writing academic work. Just a quick example here. The reason why I was also tying in generative AI with generativity, I did a very qualitative, not rigorous analysis of large language model, for example, that you would have for each of the dimensions of generativity. And I would argue that the capacity for leverage of a large language model is relatively high because it enables valuable accomplishments. The adaptability is contingent because some large language models are very specific to certain contexts, whereas otherwise are very general purpose. They're built differently. The ease of mastery is low by default if I just take the model, okay? And I'll specify why after, but if I just look at the model itself, the ease of mastery is low. If I'm not an AI researcher, I can't just go and build my own easily. And the accessibility is also low because I need to have all the equipment and whatnot if I want to build my own. So it's not that easy. But if I look at what OpenAI has...
I have a question. Sir, I have a question from Zoom meeting. Zoom meeting.
Sorry.
Connected to the Zoom meeting. Can I ask a question?
Sorry.
Am I audible? So we are connected. Yes.
Hey, Gregory, are you okay for a question?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
I understand.
Can I ask my question, please?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to be here and the part of it. I had a question like, as we are talking about ChatGPT. So ChatGPT is being like, we can get any answers. We should be very specific to the keywords to be asked, right? So I really wanted to ask, like, is ChatGPT was so important to be a part of? And as a student, does ChatGPT really worth it? And talking about Google, Google also answers us the same, like we can get answers from Google also. So what is your point of view regarding the ChatGPT? How is it really beneficial being a digitalization world coming through there?
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I understood the last words, but I understood the beginning. And if I misunderstood, let me know. I'll get
Okay,
to
sir.
that. I'll get to that actually in a minute. But the point is, I agree with you. You can look at Bing AI. You can look at Bard from Google. You can look at the other one. Meta has some as well. That actually has more than one. And my argument is that what ChatGPT has done that's better than the others is not necessarily the model itself, it's what's around it. Specifically the API and everything that comes around it to facilitate access and use by other people. Because otherwise you just have a model and the model is not easily usable, and this is where in terms of generativity you can't do much. What OpenAI has done right from the beginning is said, build on top of our thing. And there's even, I'll show a picture in a second, they say customize GPT for your application with a single command. So what they've done really is they've put a lot of effort to make sure that they have higher adaptability and they have higher accessibility and ease of mastery as well. I don't have to know anything about AI to start my business that uses GPT. I don't have to, and I shouldn't. That's kind of the point they're trying to make. Leave it to us with all the potential negative consequences associated with that, of course. But that's the argument they're making, and that's the reason why they have actually done really well so far. In terms of technical performance, GPT 3.5 is a lot less good than GPT-4, but the thing is, it doesn't really matter. What matters is how easily can I do something with it? And this is what OpenAI really understood when they made ChatGPT as a conversational agent. In my opinion, it's that they made it so that anyone could interact with it and see how it worked in terms of getting an output. And that, in terms of fostering rapid use and adoption, has helped tremendously. And this is where we had an adoption rate of 100 million users, faster than TikTok, Instagram, and all the other ones that came before, for a chatbot, basically. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. You can't post pictures, share pictures, or anything like that, and yet the interest has been so strong. So this is really what I think OpenAI has done well, because GPT was available before, but we didn't know about it as everyday people. Researchers knew about it. Companies, some of them knew about it for auto completion of emails and documents and whatnot. But in terms of actually putting it in the hands of users and making it easy for them to start using it, they have made, and free as well, they have made it very accessible. And in my opinion, this is why there's more potential for generativity here compared to other models that are available, that are free, but don't necessarily have these qualities that make it easy for me to use it for another purpose that I have. That's just, if I have to sign up for Google Cloud Platform and enter some lengthy agreement and it's very complicated just to do that, that's a barrier for me as someone who just wants to get my business running. If I'm trying to innovate quickly, rapidly, that's a potential issue. So there are other tools that exist, and there's going to be more. My argument is that what matters is not just the core, that's the model that sits in the middle, it's everything that gravitates around it that enables people to interact with it. And this is what Google, for example, in my opinion, didn't do very well at first. They're trying to catch up, but this is something that OpenAI did really well. And without any concerns with security and whatnot, or at least from what it looks like, there's a lot of undesirable consequences associated with that, with doing that. But in terms of impact on getting people to use it, it's been extremely positive. So I don't know, does that answer your question, or did I?
Yes, sir, you did. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Can
no
I ask
problem.
you one more question?
Sure.
Sir, actually, I wanted to ask, as a student, like looking to our younger ones. So for them, ChatGPT is the easier way, a mean of getting answers for every assignment or any this education related assignment, studies related. So don't you believe it's being a negative impact for, rather than looking forward, like working hard for it, searching for it, but directly getting an answer from the chat GPT, it's a positive impact or negative impact for students?
It's a good question. If you ask my students, they'll say it's very positive. I'll have a different opinion. Specifically in the context of education, I'm looking at the time to make sure I don't go over. In the context of education, there are some efforts that are being made, and in our faculty, we're having discussions very frequently about, okay, how can we, first of all, nobody's going to pretend we can block it or that people are not going to be using it. So the question is more about how can you incorporate it so that students, if they use it, will have to think about how they use it. For example, having to cite all the interactions they've had with it, or also, can I use it, generate something with it, and ask the students to criticize it, for instance. Like there are ways to try to leverage the tool to help you without pretending that it's just not there. Because very early on, Italy, not because of that, but due to GDPR concerns, Italy blocked it. I think it's in New York. There's a university that tried to block it, but it's not going to work, because if it's not ChatGPT, it's something else. So it's just the cat's out of the bag now, and then we just have to live with it, kind of. But there are ways to change how we do teaching so that we can try to get students, even if they use it, or we can actually encourage them to use it, but with certain boundaries. That being said, certain courses that were exclusively based on memorization, for example, which is not necessarily the best approach for pedagogy to begin with, that's not good. So you can do paper and pencil exams.
Thank you so much, sir, for the answer.
You're welcome. So are we there yet? That was the question I asked at first. And I'm going back to the idea that I suggested earlier, which is acceleration. And it relates to something that in an MISQ paper, Bharadwaj Al talked about when they talked about speed. But here I think it's not just how fast you go, it's how much faster you're going. It's the rate of acceleration. It's like the derivative rather than the coefficient, right? This is where we're getting right now. And we can think about how long it takes to design and implement new technology. It's going much faster than it used to. So iterating is also much faster. How long it takes before we put something in the hands of users. Going back to the example of OpenAI, that includes things like marketing and whatnot, if you can use generative technologies to help you with that. How long it takes to perform research. So as researchers, we see this influx of papers coming in on a daily basis, and the volume and the velocity of that is increasing. Conferences now, the amount of papers that come out is huge as well. So, it's just going faster and faster, and it's something that we have to deal with. It's about how long it takes to publish research. In some domains, like in ours, it can be quite lengthy, and by the time the paper is out, technology has moved on to something else. It's nice, but it's an issue. In some domains, they're trying to shorten the time for publication, focus on much narrower contributions so that they can actually get the papers out fast enough. Because journals also have backlogs of papers that they're trying to push through as well. The other thing is, with digital phenomenon, more or less everything can become a natural experiment. You have often the ability to capture the behaviors of people as they're using technology. This is something we didn't have 10, 15 years ago. And when we have tools that provide APIs, whether it's GitHub or others, we have the ability to capture interactions with the tools and to effectively measure things as they happen, which is huge. But at the same time, there are some caveats with that too, of course, because we can assimilate certain behaviors online with certain variables, and just because it's convenient, but not necessarily because it makes sense. But the point is, it feels like things are just getting faster and faster, and it's not necessarily easy to deal with. So Going back to the paper that was published in 2019 on digital transformation in Journal of Strategic Information Systems, thinking about that, what I noticed is that a lot of people focused on the front end of the paper. So the definition of digital transformation, either saying it's good or criticizing it more recently, and trying to push forward this idea that we need to have clarity in the concepts that haven't been very clear. 4 years later, however, what I find interesting going back to the paper is that the agenda is still relevant, meaning that it's not just important, but research hasn't necessarily moved a lot in that direction. One of the key sentences I heard from the reviewers when I was working on the paper was, be bold for the agenda. I was like, I don't know what more you want from me. This is as bold as I can be. And they're like, no, you have to be bolder. So I said, okay, I'll look into ethics. And now it's something that we see a lot when we talk about generative AI. But at that time, 2018, it wasn't necessarily very popular, but we see more and more researchers from ethics or IS researchers going to ethics because they see the implications of these developments. And what it does is if we go to acceleration, it encourages short-term gains. You know, it's like, let's do this quickly and we'll figure out long-term impacts later. This is exactly what's happening with OpenAI, where people start to say, okay, slow down. But then if you slow down, Bill Gates just came out and said, if we slow down, the others are not slowing down. So it's not necessarily a good strategy either. So there's a lot of questions being asked about what's the right thing to do. There's also, the question of just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean that we should. And I think it's important to ask those questions. So to finish on this, we have more and more phenomenon-driven research. And the question that I ask with this is, it's very interesting because it's very current. We can follow what's happening. The more difficult question is the lasting impact of that research in 5 years. Are we still going to think that we've built on something, or we just did something quickly and there's no lasting impact? And some people argue it's good or bad. It's just different ways to look at it. The fundamentals tend to remain stable longer. So I think they're still relevant, they're still important, and they give potential for cumulative knowledge, because otherwise it's like we're always starting from scratch. We need also to question the assumption, and we see that a lot with generative AI, and in the context of generativity, that technology just happens. People make decisions about technology, and in information systems, this is what we're supposed to be interested in. It's the intersection between humans and technology, but it's not just this tool that takes over the world. There's people out there making decisions and influencing how the technology is being used and made available to people or not. And these choices change with time, and they're also motivated. So right now, the OpenAI CEO, I don't pick at him in particular just because he's all over the news, said that, we should slow down with AI and we should regulate it because it's dangerous, or it could be dangerous. There's people who say it's very nice, and there's people who say, well, you say that because people are going to come to you to ask for advice, and then you can decide or influence what regulation is going to look like on that area. So there's a lot of power and politics still at play in these areas. Human-centered AI, which is something people often call for, it's not just making sure that the human is in the loop, but it's also thinking about the human who's contributing to design the system. We make choices when we design these systems, and there are implications to those choices. There's, at least for now, it's not machines building machines yet, but it could be important. We talk also very little about some other consequences of generative AI. One of them, just out of top of my head, is resource consumption. So in a world where we increasingly call for companies to be very responsible in terms of their consumption of resources and energy, the amount of energy required to train and use ChatGPT to ask it to write a poem for us in the style of a 15th century Italian person, which is, it's fun, but it's not necessarily very productive for society. One could argue there's a lot of energy being consumed through that. We have no idea about that footprint. There's people trying to estimate it, and it seems to be very large. But that's something that potentially we should look into as we try to reduce our energy consumption, because if we simply shift this consumption by outsourcing it to someone else, we could be carbon neutral, but that's just because we're putting that footprint somewhere else. It's not necessarily a good idea. The question then also is, should we slow down? Can we slow down? Like I said earlier, and how can we address the blur between regulation and ethics? Right now, for me, this is a big issue that I struggle with, is that regulation I can understand, it's good, bad. Ethics is very difficult for me to tackle. I don't have the training for that. I don't know well about ethics, but I know it's complicated and it's messy. And the question is, is regulation going to be enough, or do we need to have pressures more at the level of norms that are going to make people abide by certain rules, not because it's the law, but because they think it's the right thing to do? And right now, it's something that needs to be looked into, because it's very complicated. If you look at the number of ethical and legal frameworks that are being in the works by different governments, it's very, very complicated. Everyone has their own definition of responsible AI, fairness, bias, and whatnot. So that if you're trying to think about a company that deals with people located across the globe, I don't know how you design these systems abiding by all these rules. To me, that's a very complex question. And so the question is, can we ever address it? Can we actually satisfactorily address this question, knowing that even if we do now, in a year, we might not? Because what's right now is not necessarily what's right in 6 months or in a year or in a different place. And that going back to this idea that will never be done, basically. The positive note is that we as researchers get a lot of opportunities these days to participate in initiatives. If you look at different organizations that are crafting these regulations, for example, or are looking into the implications of digital technologies, there's more and more calls for researchers to be involved in that. So beyond just being academics that do research papers, we have the opportunity to bring out the fruit of our work and to contribute to these discussions. And it's an opportunity for a more engaged form of scholarship, which is not always easy to do, because depending where you are in your career and what your interests are, it's not always easy to do that. But the interesting point is that there is a space for that, and I think that's very interesting as well, because it allows us to contribute in a shape that we may not have been trained or used to in the past. And I'm sorry if I think I'm 3 minutes over. Thank you very much. If you have any questions or comments, please, I'll be very happy to take them. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
So if we look at it from a strategic management point of view, we went through the whole cycle of building products and services by renting information technology resources or digital resources, right? So the whole concept behind SaaS and PaaS and all of that, right? So a part of the company or infrastructure was rented pretty much. Now, when we look at products being built on ChatGPT, etc., a bigger core component of the intellectual resource is actually being rented. So we have, in essence, much more dependency on this service than we've had at any time in the past. So for an organization to be making strategic decisions, given that they're dependent on this one piece of technology that's driving their product and service entirely, what are some of the implications that we should be thinking about from a strategic management point of view? So for example, before doing this, especially in public companies where the ultimate responsibility lies with the board to make decisions on the direction, how would that change in the future, or how is it changing now? Or do we see given that lack of regulation, what sort of landscape should we be looking at, given the next couple years to the next decade?
I think it's a very complex question. It's a very good question, but it's difficult to answer. One of the things that I see in some companies is at some point people said, oh, I think it was attributed to the Microsoft CEO, every company is a software company. If you're not a software company, you're not doing it right. I'm not necessarily saying that every company should be an AI company, for example, but one of the things that I've seen is companies start to hire people to not necessarily develop expertise to do things in-house, but to be able to incorporate that knowledge into how they think about building products and services. For instance, and it's not just, oh, we have let's say an AI team. No, we have a team that helps the business implement certain ideas using AI, but that team is not disconnected from the business. It's strongly interweaved with the business people so that when they propose things, these ideas can be bounced against the business, and the business can have an answer that says, that's not what we do, even if technically it's feasible and technically you can get, let's say, a much more performant model using these variables. This is not something we should be doing. And when you take purely technical people that are focused on, let's say, optimizing a model, they don't have these concerns because that's not what they do. But this is something that has to come from somewhere else. So this idea of breaking silos that was brought during the panel and having these channels of communication become extremely important, because otherwise you're going to put something out there that really doesn't fit with the business just because it's technically good. And I think that's one of some companies they're realizing that. So they're getting the right people they're trying to get the right people in the right place to help. At the board level, for instance, it's going to be interesting. Some boards are going to be driven by shareholder value, and they're going to be exclusively thinking about how do we maximize earnings for the next quarter. They're going to take a very short-term approach to this. Over the long term, whether it's going to be a good idea or not, that's still up for debate. I don't have the answer for that, unfortunately. I wish I did. I knew how to invest in the market, but that's something that will only. But I agree with you 100%. We're only increasing our dependency on other companies over time. As we rent capacity for infrastructure, for computing, for storage, and now for AI as a service, or if you consider it a piece of software or whatnot, and you incorporate it into a lot of the activities that you have in your business, you're just becoming extremely dependent. So when ChatGPT came out, there are some companies that had been working, let's say, on developing their own chatbots. And some people were looking at them and being like, haha, look, I can do what you spent 5 years doing now in 2 months. But their point is, no, we want to control that aspect. It's core to what we want to do. We want to keep it in-house. When OpenAI started putting ChatGPT available and we said, oh, cool, we can use it in class. No, you can't, because sometimes it's down and you don't even know why and you don't know for how long, right? So OpenAI had to become a provider of services that I don't think they figured out they needed to do that. They were just putting the tool out there. They didn't realize, oh, we need to provide service levels. We need to provide tiers for businesses that don't want their data to be used to retrain the model. We need to do this. They had to build the ship as they were literally making it fly. So I think that shifted a lot of what they had to focus on, and they didn't have necessarily to focus on the model. They had to focus on what was around it. So those, improving the API access, figuring out a cost structure for the API, that kind of stuff, which in the beginning wasn't really out there. And a lot of the questions were, we're figuring it out, we'll get back to you type of thing. But yeah, I think that would be my limited answer to that.
Thank you, Gregory, for the presentation. It was very thought-provoking. My question is very short. At individual level, do you think people will become more innovative by using generative AI technology? To put it into context or be more specific, say if you ask students to do an assignment of writing a report, do you think you will see less innovative reports or more innovative reports because they can use ChatGPT for an assigned task? And I think it applies to more general context as well outside of education.
It's a very good question. I think it could go either way. One way it can go into being more innovative is depending how you frame it as the teacher who requires them to do the assignment. That means having, for example, certain points for having more innovative, something more creative or more innovative in the result that's being produced. And also, it could be negative if all you're measuring is, some sort of output that's very generic. But if you target very specific outputs, I think then you have the potential. But the students it has to be clearly communicated, and the students have to understand it, and it has to probably be reinforced by the teacher then that this is something you're going to be looking at when you evaluate the papers. Simply reiterating what's known or what's out there in the book wouldn't be enough. So a lot of the things that we do right now, or we try to do, is to force them to articulate things in context of a case that ChatGPT doesn't know about, for example, and can't know about. So one of the assignments in the class I gave, I wrote a case. Of course, ChatGPT doesn't know about it. It sounds like a good idea on paper. The thing is, with the new versions of ChatGPT, you could give it the case and say, hey, here's the context, and now do something with it. So it defeats the purpose as well. So I think targeting specific aspects is something that could be interesting, but it's getting tricky. It's definitely getting tricky. To give you an example, there's a researcher you might have heard of, Ethan Mollick. I think he's at Wharton. He uses ChatGPT a lot, and he gives seminars and he gives advice. He has this website, I think it's called Just One More Thing, or I forgot. And he showcases with the new version of ChatGPT that for now you have to pay for, the version 4. You can upload a file and ask it to do all sorts of descriptive analysis, even regression analysis with it. So, when you have like an undergrad or grad class where you ask them to do data wrangling and whatnot and basic data analysis, it's getting pretty good at that too. So I think what matters is not the analysis, it's the interpretation of that. So in the context of that, now that you know this is the result, explain to me that result and tell me what it means, or make a recommendation based on that. This is where the tool is not as good, because it's still going to invent some stuff. And that might be one way to try to ensure that there's a contribution from the students that goes further than just inputting the things in the tool. That would be, yeah. But it's not easy, and with every version or every new iteration on the same tool, you're like, okay, what do I do? I think there was a meeting organized by the government of Quebec, actually, last week or earlier this week, to discuss this even at the CEGEP and high school level, to start to get the input from teachers to say, okay, what are your worries and what should we be doing and whatnot. So it's definitely an open question, I think, for a lot of us still. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation today. Thank you for joining us here today in the space and joining us on Zoom. Let's give Gregory a round of applause for his insights.
Thank you very much.
I do believe that is all the time we have today. So we are going to go ahead and just close up the Zoom and say goodbye. But you can always revisit this conversation on YouTube pretty much now. So you can find that online. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll catch you at the next event.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. for being a part of us.